Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes. One more time, I bet we can do that better. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Do we remember playing that childhood game on the playground? Yes? Holding hands in a circle, laughing with gleeful, anxious anticipation at the thought of actually falling down when we screamed that last line, right? Fun game to play as a kid. Does anyone happen to know, though, the kind of dark history behind Ring Around the Rosie? A few, Janet? Okay. Yeah. It's kind of a dark story behind it. It comes from the 1600s, during the time of the Great Plague of London. And a ring around the rosy was a skin rash. I guess we might think of it like ringworm or maybe a tick bite, when you get the bullseye, right? And when you got the ring around the rosy rash, it was the first sign that you likely had the plague. And to ward off the plague, as a superstitious way of keeping the plague away, people would stuff their pockets with posies. Kind of like you would maybe put a garland of garlic around your neck to keep away the vampires, right? Unfortunately, it didn't really work. And those who found themselves with a ring around the rosy, well, most, if not all, well, they all fell down. I'm sorry, that's kind of dark and terrible, and I'm sorry to burst your childhood bubble with that story. But like many things, playing a childhood game like Ring Around the Rosie isn't something we maybe take too seriously or think too much about until we know the dark and destructive thing that lurks behind it. And once we do, we may think twice about it, right? People of faith know a thing or two about what this is like when we take seriously the dark and destructive power of sin in our lives. We all know that we all fall down sometimes. It's not fun and games, it's no laughing matter. We have all at some time in our lives and in some way, shape, or manner, we've known the pain of the fall that comes from sin and the hurt that it has caused either for others or within ourselves. Today we return again to the brief statement of faith, and we come to words that express our understanding and our taking seriously human nature's penchant to act in opposition to God, our Creator. Acts which cause great harm to ourselves, to others, and to the earth. So I ask us again today to affirm our faith in the words of section 3 of the brief statement of faith. It's in the bulletin. Our attention today will be focused in particularly on the underlined words, but let's say the whole section together as an affirmation of faith today. Again, it's in the bulletin. We trust in God, whom Jesus called Abba, Father. In sovereign love, God created the world good and makes everyone equally in God's image, male and female, of every race and people, to live as one community. But we rebel against God. We hide from our Creator. Ignoring God's commandments, we violate the image of God in others and ourselves, accept lies as truth, exploit neighbor and nature, and threaten death to the planet entrusted to our care. We deserve God's condemnation, yet God acts with justice and mercy to redeem creation. In everlasting love, the God of Abraham and Sarah chose a covenant people to bless all families of the earth. Hearing their cry, God delivered the children of Israel from the house of bondage. Loving us still, God makes us heirs with Christ of the covenant. Like a mother who will not forsake her nursing child, like a father who runs to welcome the prodigal home, God is faithful still. Again, some deep and detailed words here. And last week we discussed the first part in which we talked about the image of God and seeing and honoring the image of God in all people. We'll continue to flesh out this entire section, but for today, again, our focus is on the underlined words. I'd like us to say those again so we let them sink in a bit. But we rebel against God. We hide from our Creator. Ignoring God's commandments, we violate the image of God in others and ourselves, accept lies as truth, exploit neighbor and nature, and threaten death to the planet entrusted to our care. We deserve God's condemnation yet. And no, my type A friends, the way this ends is not a typo, and we'll get to that hanging yet in a minute. But for now, circle the words, we violate the image of God in others and ourselves. Last week, we considered and lifted up some ways we honor God's image in ourselves and in others. But today, we face the reality that we too often do the opposite. And I propose that sin is just this: any violation of God's image in ourselves and in others. I propose this violation is and continues to be the greatest cause of the downfall of humanity. And any violation is in direct conflict with the greatest commandment, and that is, paraphrased slightly, to love God with our whole being, and to love every human being as one loves one's self. That is the greatest commandment as Christ taught it to us. Have you ever wondered how different the world would be if everybody followed that commandment? How different the world would be if we truly loved God with our whole being and loved everyone as we love ourselves. It is our call. But we all fall down sometimes. And as such, we violate the image of God in others and in ourselves. And there are many ways that we do this, and to list them all, we would be here all day. The brief statement of faith lifts out certain ways in which we do this, and to barely scratch the surface, we say that we accept lies as truth. For some, it may be the lie that there is anything or anyone greater than God. And whoever it is that has our attention and our trust, it's misplaced trust. Maybe it's trust in temporary things. Maybe it's trust in money or power or in political voices who want our attention. But it's misplaced trust when we put that trust over and above our trust in God. It's a lie that we accept sometimes as truth, isn't it? Another may be the lie that any one group of people is greater than another, greater enough to actually say that violence against that group is okay. That's another lie that we may believe as truth. There are many. What may be the lies that you accept as truth? We exploit neighbors. That is, we leave others open to vulnerability, rather than helping and supplying our neighbors with what they need. Who is my neighbor? Remember the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember the man beaten and left for dead, open to vulnerability, stepped over by those who you would have thought would have helped, and it's only till the neighbor, the Samaritan, the neighbor who he didn't expect to show up, the neighbor he didn't even know that he had, is the one who helps him, right? Jesus says your neighbor is that one who acts with compassion. And your neighbor may be the one next door or across the world or even in your own home. Your neighbor is the one who needs help. And individuals exploit neighbors often by sins of omission, by not wanting to get too involved. right? And perhaps ignoring the needs that they see right in front of them. Nations exploit neighbors by shutting down their borders and refusing to help migrants. And now the rejection of the people from the Bahamas, it's an abomination of national proportions. There are many ways that we exploit our neighbors. How might you see neighbors in need that are being exploited? How might you help? And we exploit nature, threatening death to the planet entrusted to our care. I was trying to think of an example, too many to mention, but a person I used to work with came to mind, and this person used to like to say he absolutely refused to recycle anything. And he used to like to say that once the collectors take the trash away, it's Earth's problem. And I used to try to say to him, as I say to us today, to deny that it's our problem and our responsibility to care for the earth is to choose to live with willful ignorance of the problems that we already have and those that are only getting worse. There are many ways in which we exploit nature. What might be some that you can think of? There are many ways we violate God's image and ignore God's commandments. To deny any of them is to live with willful ignorance and willing acceptance of the destructive power of sin. But to accept and to confess is to live like Christians. The letter of 1 John says, "If we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and make a liar out of God. But if we confess, God will forgive us and cleanse us of all unrighteousness." This is why we have confessional prayer every week in corporate worship. And whenever I preach on confession, I always like to give the commercial that says, it is not the only time that you may enter into confessional prayer throughout the week. But it's good when we do, because together we say that we get it. We all fall down sometimes, and so together we can pray the prayer of confession. Together in silent moment we can hand over to God all that we brought on our hearts, and together we can hear the assurance of God's forgiveness and accept that again together. And it's good that we do. And you can pray confessionally every day. It's probably good to do. Morning, noon, and night. Right? Because it's only through contrite confession that we get to the yet. And to receive words of assurance of God's forgiveness. We need confessional prayer. We need to engage in it. We need to hear those words of assurance, because we can get stuck, can't we? We can get stuck in the sin, and we can begin to believe the lie that there's no way out. But our sin is never the end of the story. This is our faith and our trust as Christians. Even in the story from the fall, from Genesis, the seriousness of the consequence of sin is obvious. There is a disruption in the relationship with God that was never meant to be. But let's not overlook the yet, even in it. Do you notice that God, despite God's overwhelming disappointment, that God does not abandon Adam and Eve? Did you notice that line at the end of the reading? If you blink, you miss it. God makes clothing for them. He makes clothing for the man and for the woman. He clothes them. Despite God's overwhelming disappointment, God still is there for them. He doesn't let them go. He will still be with them. And from that point forward, if you take the scriptures seriously, you see that God just makes one attempt after another to be with God's creation. This is what we proclaim to believe. Do we trust in this? I hope. Maybe we're still working on it. Maybe we're not quite there yet. And that's okay. Because sometimes it takes a lifetime of confession and assurance to get to the yet. This was the case for Robert Robinson, a young man from the 1700s who for most of his young life had lived, I looked this up, so I have to say it in this way. He lived a life of debauchery, right? He lived a life of debauchery. Booze, prostitutes, hanging with the wrong crowd, destructive influence on his life, bringing him down. Nobody knew what to do with him. His family didn't know what to do with him. And then one day he stumbled into a church, and he heard a preacher preaching about God's forgiveness and grace and power to change things in his life. And by hearing that word, Robinson turned his life around. And it wasn't once and for all, right? Because if you read the story of his life, he had this moment of epiphany and this moment of great transformation, and then he went along in life, and then he kind of, if you will, he took a fall. And he picked himself back up, and he kept going, and he fell again. And then he picked himself up, and he kept always leaning, though, on the grace of God to pick him up. Always leaning on the presence of God in his life to be there with him. By the end of his life, Robinson had come to fully realize the power of confession and assurance and repentance and God's grace and forgiveness and ever-presence in his life. It's a powerful story. Do you know it? I bet you know the song that he wrote that captures this trust in God's grace. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to stand and we're going to sing it because it's our next hymn. I'm going to ask you to stand, and before we sing, I'm going to encourage you again to bring whatever is burdening your heart today. Maybe it's that which you already lifted up as we prayed the prayer of confession before. And I know you're thinking, Mark, we already did that. Why do we have to do it again? Well, if you were listening, you know why. Because it's good whenever we do. So I'm going to ask you to stand. Go ahead and stand. And again, just take a moment of quiet confession and lift up to God all that which may burden your heart today, all that has come between you and your relationship with God or with another. Any ways that you see in yourself, ways that perhaps you have not honored the image of God in another or in yourself. Or maybe it's ways that you yourself have been hurt. Or maybe it's just feelings that you have toward the violation of God's image out there in the world. Thoughts and feelings that are not constructive but are indeed destructive to your own spirit. And now I invite us to sing number 11, both as a prayer of confession and an assurance of pardon. Let's sing, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. It's number 11.